And here we go. Welcome to our third session of our class on Kabbalah. And as you can see, the subject tonight is Lurianic Kabbalah, the soul, angels, and enhancing our Jewish spirituality. And I will take kind of breaks and ask if there are any questions. But if you have questions, don't hesitate to jump in. As before, a word from our sponsor. My role as community rabbi is made possible by the Jewish Federation of Ventura County. And you can see a website there for making gifts. And copies of slides as before on the website. Go to classes, go to lectures and classes. And here's the 3-session class, copies of the text, suggested readings, which I'll show you. And I just added a link to a learner's guide to blessings, which we're going to be discussing briefly. And as I think I mentioned, I also am recording the classes. So we have class number 1, Introduction to History. This has been corrected now. Class number 2, our last week's class, the Zohar, and so on. So if you missed any classes or would like to see them again, feel free to jump on my website and check those out. Okay, sometimes people ask tough questions like, what kind of God would allow a thing like this to happen? And it turns out Kabbalah has an answer. Lurianic Kabbalah. I'm sorry?
Let me try something.
Okay, now I think Larry is, see if I can find Larry again. No, I don't know what's going on. Okay. So Isaac Luria was a very important person in the history of Kabbalah. He is living around the time of the expulsion from Spain. He's living around the time of the expulsion from Spain. He teaches in Sfat only 2.5 years before dying in an epidemic in 1572. He is called Ha'ari, the lion. Ari is an acronym for Ashkenazi Rebbe Yitzchak. And he wrote almost nothing, but his students recorded his teachings, and he has a major influence on Kabbalah.
What?
The interesting thing about Lurianic Kabbalah, at least the thing about Lurianic Kabbalah that interests me most, is his explanation for creation, for how God created the universe. So in the beginning, before the beginning, there was nothing. There was no thing, but there was God. So the universe at this point in time is all God and only God. And then God decides to create a physical universe. Maybe we'll talk about that for a second. Actually, I'm going to try and play with stop sharing and discussing. So here's an interesting question for you. Why do you think God would want to create a physical universe? You can unmute yourself actually, let's see, I think I can unmute you all. Okay, yeah, I'll unmute you all. Why would God want to create a physical universe? Do you think?
Pretty lonely.
Was God lonely? Okay, that's one possibility. Any other thoughts?
Well, what strikes me is that it's kind of solipsistic to think that that without us, God has nothing. Okay, it's a strange idea to me, because I would think that God would have whatever he wanted, and if he wanted to create a universe, he could do that as well.
No question. From a religious point of view, if God wanted to create a universe, God can. The question is why. Any other thoughts? There are two traditional answers to this. One I really like and one I really don't like. The answer that I really don't like is, if God is to be praised, then God needs entities, people, to praise God. The one I really like is the idea that God loves stories. You can say that's a sort of a take on God being lonely, but if God loves stories, is lonely, is interested in other things, then we need some other things. So we'll go back to the presentation. So in the beginning, before the beginning, all God, only God. Now God decides to create a physical universe, and the question is how? And in Lurianic Kabbalah, the idea is God takes a point in space, and now the problem is, because God completely fills everything, there is no room for physical space, so God contracts. Basically, if you look at the image on the left, God draws away from this spot to make room for a physical universe. So in this physical universe, there is still God permeating, but now there's room for a physical universe. The contraction is called Tzimtzum. If you study Kabbalah, you're going to come up and hear this term time and time again. And so God withdraws from the spot and then channels divine light into the universe. And of course, God creates something to hold the divine light, and these are called kelim, or vessels. And this is kind of an interesting image. I mean, if you can read the Hebrew, what you have here are the 10 sfirot, but arranged concentrically. So here is Keter, Chachma, Bina, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, and so on. So the idea that I've seen is it's almost like trickling down. God's light is trickling down into these vessels, which are designed to hold the light. And then something very strange happens. Oh, okay, so we're actually going to read about this. And as I said, there's a lot of text in Kabbalah, and there's some brilliant people writing these texts, if they're modern texts, and it's worth reading. So this is from Danny Matt, Essential Kabbalah. At the beginning of creation, when Ein Sof means without limit, withdrew its presence all around in every direction. It left a vacuum in the middle, surrounded on all sides by the light of Ein Sof, empty precisely in the middle. The light withdrew like water in a pond displaced by a stone. When a stone is dropped in a pond, the water at that spot does not disappear. It merges with the rest. So the withdrawn light converged beyond, and in the middle remained a vacuum. Then all the opacity and density of judgment within the light of Ein Sof, like a drop in the ocean, was extracted. Descending into the vacuum, it transformed into an amorphous mass, surrounded in every direction by the light of Ein Sof. Out of this mass emanated the four worlds. We talked about this last time: emanation, creation, formation, and actualization. I'm going to jump up here. To fashion pottery, the potter first takes an unformed mass of clay and then puts his hand inside the mass to shape it. So the supernal emanator put its hand into the amorphous mass, that is, a ray of light returned from above. As this light began to enter the mass, vessels were formed. From the purest light, Keter, next Chachma, then Bina, and so on through all 10 Sfirot. Since Keter was the purest and clearest of all the vessels, it could bear the light within it. But Chachma and Bina, though more translucent than those below, were not like Keter. Not having its capacity, their backs broke and they fell from their position. As the light descended further, 6 points appeared, 6 fragments of what had been 1 point of light. Thus the vessels shattered. Their spiritual essence, the light, ascended back to the mother's womb, while the shattered vessels fell to the world of creation. We'll talk about this in a second. The spot where Jewish tradition says God created the universe, is in Jerusalem. No big surprise there. And it's the Mount. It's the Temple Mount. This you will recognize. This building is the Dome of the Rock. So, it's like, what color was, Washington's white horse? Inside the Dome of the Rock is a big rock. This traditionally is thought to be Mount Moriah in Jewish tradition, where Abraham went to sacrifice his son. It is understood by archaeologists to be the location of the original Holy of Holies in the temple. And in Muslim tradition, it's a spot where Muhammad ascended into heaven on his winged horse. Inside the rock, there is actually a cave for prayer. And I've actually spent hours inside that cave. So this is called Even HaShtiyah, the foundation stone. So in Jewish mystical tradition, this is that spot that God withdrew from to create creation. But there is this cosmic accident, which I will admit I don't entirely understand. And the cosmic accident is the breaking of the vessels. It's called Shevirat Kelim. So this light is flowing into the universe at the very highest level of the Sefirot. It's perfectly clear. So if you send a very powerful light through a perfectly clear pane of glass, nothing will happen. But if the glass has any opacity, it will absorb the light, and if there's a lot of power in the light, the glass will shatter. So the basic idea in Lurianic Kabbalah is something went wrong, and the vessels shattered, and so the world is filled with brokenness, and so we have a universe that needs repair. And every time a mitzvah is performed, in traditional Judaism, we would say every time a Jew does a mitzvah, a holy spark is released and a little bit of the universe is repaired. I'll say one or two more things and then open it up and see if people have questions. So I often say, for me, one of the most astonishing insights of Kabbalah is that God cannot do the repair. God cannot repair the universe without our help. This repair of the universe, or repair of everything, is called Tikkun Olam, and really has become the centerpiece of Reform Judaism. It predated Judaism, Reform Judaism, but the idea of Tikkun Olam has come to be understood in Reform Judaism as really being social action of righting wrongs, of feeding the hungry, curing disease, and making justice and so on. So our efforts as God's partner are required to bring the Messiah and redemption. And again, I would say the most astonishing thing for me about all of this is the idea that God cannot do it by God's self. God actually needs us to do it. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second, see if there's any questions or comments. There's some chat going on. I don't know if that's...
I have a question.
Yes.
This is Neil. My question is that I understand what you're saying, that the universe has broken and now it needs repair, and we have Tikkun Olam, and I think that's a beautiful way to flow through life. But my question is the universe really not working? Is it really broken and it does actually need repair, or isn't it things kind of okay the way it's been going, or it's really broken?
Okay, so I can answer for myself or I can answer for Kabbalah. So in terms of my own theory, my own understanding, and I'm going to be doing some future teaching on this and give you the schedule as we move toward the end of the class. I would say the universe is operating according to the laws of physics. And that's good news and bad news. It's good news when we get on our bicycles and the law of conservation of angular momentum keeps us from falling down. It's bad news when the tectonic plates shift against one another and we have a huge earthquake.
Of course.
In Kabbalah, the question is, why isn't everything perfect? If God is perfect and just and powerful and so on, how can there be all these problems in the world? Mm-hmm. The Kabbalistic answer to this, which I will confess puzzles me and I have problems with, is that in the creation of the universe, something went wrong. And so brokenness entered the universe. And so the vessels shattered. These vessels absorbed the divine light, and they're called klipot. in Hebrew. And then every time we do something good in the world, we've healed a little bit of the universe, and these divine sparks are released. And of course, in Jewish tradition, in Kabbalah, it's only the Jews that count. So talk about chutzpah, we're 0.2% of the world's population, but the entire fate of the universe, not just the world, depends on whether you eat kosher tonight, whether you say the right blessing. So when we get puzzled about why a Chabad rabbi would stand on the corner and ask me to put on tefillin, it's because when a Jew does a mitzvah, a little bit of the universe is healed on some mystic plane. And both I and the Chabad rabbi may know I'm never going to put on tefillin again. I think it's silly. I think it's, medieval. But from a mystical point of view, there's cosmic significance. A little bit of the universe has been healed. Ruth, I'm going to unmute you just in case. Whoops, I'm going to try and unmute. I can't unmute. Oh, there you are.
Oh, no, I'm happy to stay
Okay.
muted.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm muting.
Whoops. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Jay, yeah. You're muted. I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Earlier you said God was up there and he blew breath or something. And I got the impression that somebody felt that God was alone up there. Didn't God have angels up there with him?
The question is, how did God create the universe?
Right, and didn't he have angels with him?
That's one story. I'm not sure. That's probably Kabbalistic, and I don't know if this idea of Lurianic creation precedes the angels or not. I just don't know. Okay. Any other
Well, I have
questions?
a question. Yeah.
Yes.
So it sounds to me like we're talking about a broken symmetry. Okay. And from a physical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So everything comes into being because it's broken. And that's where the universe comes from. So to say that the universe is broken, without the universe being broken, all you'd have is a bunch of light. You wouldn't have a universe.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the Kabbalistic notion. Cheryl.
How does the Lurianic story of creation, marry with the Big Bang Theory?
Other than it all beginning from a single point, I know that I'll just mention a random thing I know about this. How's that for honesty?
Okay.
There's a commentator named Nachmanides, who is very much a mystical commentator. And one of the things in his description of creation, it turns out he matches up pretty well with the Big Bang Theory. There's a writer named Gerald Schroeder. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. He is actually very much involved with Chabad, and he's an astrophysicist. So I'll just give you one example. Think about the Big Bang. Initially, you have all the mass in the universe is in one spot. And now time begins and mass begins. And so for the first few microseconds, you have a giant black hole, okay? So if you were watching this from a distance, you would see nothing, right? Because it's a black hole. Then
well, there's no light.
There's a lot of energy, but
there's no light to see with.
Hold on a second.
It's all in the black hole.
Hold on. Yes, all the energy is in the black hole.
So you couldn't see anyway.
Right. So after a while, the primordial atom expands to a point where the gravitational field can no longer hold the light. So, in astrophysical terms, it's no longer a black hole. And all of a sudden, there was light. And if you're interested in matching a Kabbalistic and Bible interpretation of creation with the Big Bang Theory, Gerald Schroeder is your guy, and I can refer you to his book. I think he misses the point because I mean, I don't take these texts that literally, but he actually does day by day an explanation of what's going on and has some very other interesting insights. Let's see, Levine's, you have your electronic hand up. I am unmuting you. I'm trying to unmute you. It's not working. Okay, I think, no, you're still muted. No,
Am I still muted now?
no, now you're good.
Okay, if every time that a Jew commits a mitzvah, performs a mitzvah, a little bit of the universe is healed. Every time a Jew commits a sin, is a little bit more broken again?
I don't think so. I think it's just a failure to do the healing. But I'm not certain about that. That's a very interesting question.
So it's a
Right.
gating function.
It's a gating function. Yeah, Bryce is going to give us the astrophysical details. Okay, Bryce, do you have anything else you wanted to add, or was your hand up from
I'm
before?
good. That was old.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the presentation. So another subject, we're now off Lurianic Kabbalah, and I want to reflect on what is soul. So there's a wonderful book, which I highly recommend, called Does the Soul Survive? A Jewish Journey to Belief in Afterlife, Past Lives, and Living with Purpose. And in his commentary, he has some beautiful writings and some insights into what is a soul. I'm down here. It says, although, actually, I'll make this a little larger. I think it can help. Although there are a variety of understandings of soul in the Jewish tradition, the common starting point is that the soul is no less than an extension of God. In the crafting of Adam, the Torah says, God formed Adam out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the neshama of life. And thus, Adam became a living creature. In the Hebrew, there are three terms used for breath: nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Words in a Jewish mystical tradition are also used to describe facets of the soul. The image of breath conveys the idea that the soul is intangible, animates light, and links us to the source of creation. In the Talmud, it says, as God fills the whole world, so also the soul fills the whole body. As God sees but cannot be seen, so also the soul sees but cannot be seen. As God nourishes the whole world, so also the soul nourishes the whole body. As God is pure, so also the soul is pure. As God dwells in the innermost part of the universe, so also the soul dwells in the innermost part of the body. I am going to move on. So just areas that I've decided to highlight. The flame is an image in the Zohar, and I've introduced the Zohar. I don't know why this is not working. Classical mystical commentary on Torah, composed by the end of the 13th century, uses the idea of flame to express the multifaceted nature of the soul. I, says Ellie Spitz, finds this image particularly helpful. Soul as divine spark possesses qualities of light. It is pure, dynamic, and a tool for awareness, which enables enlightenment. And in addition, the bands of color in a flame, ranging from blue to orange to yellow, convey that the soul, too, is composed of nestled complementary qualities. The Zohar describes three dimensions of the soul: nefesh, ruach, and neshama, and correlates them with facets of inner human existence. On a more cosmic level, it describes them as separate realms of creation. Understanding Judaism's approach to the soul requires an examination of these three dimensions of soul as described in the Zohar. Let me move this thing out of my way. Whoops, hang on, I lost it. Okay. Hold on. Soul on the most primary level of human existence is called nefesh, representing the realm of action and physical pleasure. Our bodies are the foundation of our lives, and we are fundamentally physical beings. With our bodies, we act in the world. At the next level, nefesh supports and connects with ruach, the realm of feelings, which enables personality and the expression of love. Animals too have a body and feelings, and thus have soul, but one that is limited to the lower dimension of soul possibility. With neshama, the third level of soul, we evidence uniquely human capacities. The neshama is identified with analytic thought, the quest for meaning and transcendence. Only humans ask, so we surmise, what's the significance of my life? This capacity for self-reflection and awareness is our link to God and identified as the breath of life, nishmat chaim, that God uniquely breathes into Adam. In traditional mystical writings, soul is often called by the term neshama because it is that part of the personality most identified with self-identity and transpersonal, transpersonal relationships. As we will see later, I'm going to try and, neshama is also that dimension of soul most identified with soul survival and reincarnation. Isaac Luria, who we were talking about, most influential teacher of Jewish mysticism, with the possible exception of the Zohar, identifies two more realms of soul, Chaya and Yechida, which are often grouped together as a fourth dimension of creation. These two higher spheres are accessed by intuition or disciplined imagination and might be called spirit as distinguished from soul. Because of their intrinsic link to the divine, Luria returned to the image of breath to describe these five interrelated but distinct units of soul, using the metaphor of God as a glassblower. I find this metaphor helpful for me. To blow glass requires the glass blower to blow in deeply. What he means by this is to withdraw a breath in, to take a breath, and then exhale through the glass tube. As the breath moves through the tube and through the glass, it expands and shapes it. When the work is completed, the breath rests on the glass. In reverse order, the lowest level of soul, nefesh, is the breath on the glass, the most basic level of life force present in all living things. The ruach, which means wind, is the force that blows through the glass, giving it shape. The neshama is the outward breath of the glass blower. The chaya is the inward breath of the glass blower that the glass blower takes before he blows out. And the yechida is the soul of the glass blower. So it's kind of the inner reality of the glass blower before he or she decides to blow glass in the first place. Just reading now at the bottom. When a man is born, he has only an animal soul, the nefesh. When he overcomes the evil urge, the yetzer hara, physical compulsions, such as the craving for food or sex, the person is given a ruach. The entire world of angels is then in his domain. If the person is even more worthy and he learns to master his emotions, such as anger, he is given a neshama, corresponding to the divine throne. This means that his every intent and thought creates a throne for God. When a person of this level thinks about his love of God, he is placed in the universe of love. Such a person must never remove his thoughts from God for even an instant, for God himself rests in his thoughts. I'm going to pause for a second. Does anyone find that understandable?
No.
Okay, so remember those slides from the first class. This is not supposed to be easy. You're supposed to struggle with this. Remember my thought about learning things 10 times before you can possibly even begin to get it? This is an example. So my goal here is not to get you to understand this, okay? I'm having enough trouble understanding it myself. My goal here is to expose you to the thoughts and the traditions of this material. So the next 9 times you read through it, you'll remember it a little bit. Levine's, your electronic hand is up.
No, you never put it down after my last question.
Okay, it is now down. Anybody else have a question or a comment or want to fetch?
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, we just read about where the soul comes from and where it dwells, but it was only kind of mentioned about reincarnation and soul survival. My question is kind of then where does it go after our bodies are no more?
Okay, I will comment on that briefly.
Okay.
But that's the subject of a separate 3-session, hour and a half each session
Oh, okay.
discussion. And I'll point out how you too can listen to that.
Okay.
So back to the presentation. So one idea that I particularly like is this image of when it says we're created b'tselem Elohim, one of the words, I think it's Selim, can also be understood as shadow. So we are God's shadow. So my question is, when we look at this image, can I tell what the people are doing? And, you know, presumably these are 2 adults and a baby, and they're swinging the baby and having a good time.
Mhm.
So the point is, it's a rather obvious one, the shadow and the source of the shadow are deeply linked, right? So if we are God's shadow, what does that mean? It leads to the mystical idea that we, God's shadows, force God's hands, if I can say that, by our actions. So for example, by making harmony on earth, we make harmony in the heavens. And I would add that when we do good things inspired by God and God's teachings, we bring God into the world. I often reflect on the fact that when I visit someone in the hospital, I bring God into the hospital. That person perceives it, I perceive it. And that person perceives that there's something different going on than just, you know, a routine, ordinary visit. There's an element of God when, you know, when we speak about God, and when we think about God, when we talk about God. And people sometimes feel comforted, often feel comforted by this process. And I would say God is actually doing this, the idea of God. And it doesn't matter if God actually exists. I was once giving this talk at a high holiday. It was part of my sermon. The sermon was called Demystifying Mysticism. And at the end, I was talking about, I was reading the Kaddish. And there was a woman in the congregation who lost her husband shortly before Yom Kippur, and she was just in tears, particularly at the mourner's Kaddish. And this thought struck me that when someone disappears, how does that fit into this image? And so the idea struck me, when does a shadow disappear? There's a shadow on the wall of a hand. It's when the image and the maker of the image touch at last. So with this idea, when we pass from this world into the next world, we are no longer God's shadow because we're deeply connected with God. A related thought is this idea that I often talk about, that the Hebrew word for angel, malach, is also the Hebrew word for messenger. Judaism teaches, certainly from a mystical perspective, and I would even say from a non-mystical perspective, that God sends us into the world to do God's work. Are we simple messengers or angels? Speaking Hebrew, there is no difference. This is a little writing by Larry Kushner on it, and it's just so beautiful. I'm going to take a minute to read it. I'll make it a little bit larger. The Hebrew word for angel is malach, which also means messenger. Not cherubic creatures who adorn architecture, valentines, and fantasy. They can be anyone who is sent, just as anyone who is sent can be an angel. It is required only that there be an errand, one message. In the Midrash, it says one angel never performs 2 missions, just as 2 angels never go on 1 mission. There is one great difficulty between people chosen to be God's messengers and earthly messengers. While those on errands of this world always know that they are sent, where and why, people chosen to be messengers of the Most High rarely even know that they are his messengers. Unsuspecting and unaware, consumed by their own plans and itineraries, busy at work on their own schemes, God is already sending them somewhere else. I do not know how many times in one's life one is also a messenger, but for everyone it is at least once to whom it is given to know that their errand is completed, one to whom it is given to know that their errand is completed and blessed. Completed is blessed and rare. Not so for most of us. Remember only that you are not always going where you are going for the reasons you think you are. When the angels are sent as messengers by his word, they are changed into winds. And when they minister before him, they're changed into fire. As it is said, who makes his angels into winds, his ministers a flaming fire. I'm not sure where this is quoted from. What is it like to stand into the wind? pretty much like talking to anyone. What is it like to speak to a messenger of the Most High? Like standing into the wind. There must have been a time when you entered a room and met someone, and after a while you understood that unknown to either of you, there was a reason you had met. You had changed the other, or he had changed you. By some word or deed, or just by your presence, the errand had been completed. And then perhaps you were a little bewildered or humbled and grateful, and it was over. Each lifetime is the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. For some, there are more pieces. For others, the puzzle is more difficult to assemble. Some seem to be born with a nearly completed puzzle, and so it goes. Souls go this way and that, trying to assemble the myriad parts. But know this, no one has within themselves all the pieces to their puzzle. Like before the days when they used to seal jigsaw puzzle in cellophane, ensuring all the pieces were there. Everyone carries with them at least one and many pieces to someone else's puzzle. Sometimes they know it, sometimes they don't. And when you present your piece, which is worthless to you, to another, whether you know it or not, whether they know it or not, you are the messenger from the Most High. Larry Kushner, who is one of my heroes and teachers.
Me too.
Now,
That's
I've
beautiful.
made a bunch of references to sexual imagery in the Kabbalah. And so I want to read a little bit from a source, a book that Jay Lieberman knows very well called, The Tree of Souls, Mythology of Judaism. And I'm going to be doing some teaching from that book in future evenings. The sacred bedchamber. On the very day King Solomon completed building the tabernacle in Jerusalem, God and his bride were united, and her face shone with perfect joy. There was joy for all above and below. This is a reference back to the 10 Sfirot, that one of at the bottom of the 10 Sfirot is the Shekhinah, which is a feminine word, and it's understood in biblical Hebrew. The word Shekhinah simply means God's presence. In mystical literature, it's the feminine aspect of God, or you can even say the goddess, that God has a masculine aspect and a feminine aspect. And this imagery from the Zohar is taking it quite literally. As long as the temple stood, it served as the sacred bedchamber of God the King and his bride, the Shekhinah. Every midnight she would enter through the place of the Holy of Holies, and she and God would celebrate their joyous union. The loving embrace of the king and his queen assured the well-being not only of Israel, but of also the whole world. The king would come to the queen and lie in her arms, and all that she asked of him, he would fulfill. He placed his left arm under her head. His right arm embraced her, and he let her enjoy his strength. Their pleasure in each other was indescribable. He made his home with her and took his delight between her breasts. They lay in tight embrace, her image impressed upon his body like a seal imprinted upon a page, as it is written, "Set me as a seal upon your heart," from the Song of Songs. As long as the temple stood, the king would come down from his heavenly abode every midnight and seek out his bride and enjoy her in their sacred bedchamber. But when the temple was destroyed, the Shekhinah went into exile. Bride and groom were torn apart. I love the commentaries that Howard Schwartz provides for us. This explicit myth portrays the interaction of God and his bride as a highly eroticized coupling, a sacred copulation, zivug hakodesh. This is a primal image of the sacred marriage. In the Zohar, this is referred to as the one total coupling, the full coupling as it is proper. Another section of the Zohar expands upon this. The matronita, which is a Spanish word. Remember I said there's some Spanish words that creep into the Zohar. The Shekhinah united herself with the king. From this, one body resulted. This illustrates the strong sexual dimension of Kabbalistic thought, especially in the Zohar. This also demonstrates the direct correlation between the unity and union of God and his bride and the existence of the temple in Jerusalem. The destruction of the temple brings about the separation of God and the Shekhinah and sends the Shekhinah into exile. All this comes about because of the sins of Israel. When Israel sins, these sins give power to the forces of evil, preventing the Shekhinah from uniting with her husband and forcing the divine couple to turn away from each other. When Israel repents, God and the Shekhinah turn back to each other. So important is the coupling of God and the Shekhinah that in the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the principal speaker in the Zohar, describes it as the deepest of all mysteries. According to the Talmud and a Song of Songs Midrash, one of the names of the places where the temple was built was the bedchamber. One of the images here, I've seen it described in a different way, is that when Israel sins, we go into diaspora. The temple's destroyed and we're sent out into the world. And they describe it as a parable like a king whose son sins against him, but God so loves the son that as punishment, although he's punishing the son by sending him into exile, he so loves the son that he goes into exile with the son. So God sends his presence, the Shekhinah, into exile with Israel. So what's the Shekhinah's reaction to this? Since the destruction of the temple, the Shekhinah descends night after night to the place of the temple, enters the Holy of Holies, and sees that her dwelling house and her couch are ruined and soiled. And she wanders up and down, wails and laments, and weeps bitterly. She looks at the place of the cherubs and lifts up her voice and says, my couch, my dwelling place, where my husband would come to me and lie in my arms. And all I asked of him, he would give me. My couch, my couch. Do you not remember how I came to you in joy and contentment? And how these youths, the cherubim, came forth to meet me, beating their wings in welcome? How has the Ark of the Covenant, which stood here, come to be forgotten? From here went forth nourishment for all the world, and light and blessing to all. Now I seek my husband in every place, but he is not here. My husband, where have you gone? Do you not remember how you held your left arm beneath my head and your right arm embraced me, and you vowed that you would never cease loving me, and you have forgotten me? Let me see what I have next here. Whoops. Okay, I'm going to talk about the afterlife in a second. Again, I'm going to stop sharing. I mentioned this in an earlier slide. If you read a traditional prayer book, there are these, they're called iyun tefillah, like deep meditative thoughts that you say before you pray, like before you put on your talit or before you put on your tefillin. These have been completely lost in the world of Reform Judaism. And when you read it, it talks about, I'm putting on this talis, I'm putting on this tefillin in order to unite the Holy One of Blessing, Yud Hey and Vav Hey, with his Shekhinah. So the idea is when a Jew does mitzvot, you are doing it for the purpose of reuniting God and his Shekhinah. And with this image of us being the shadow, as you may know, it is traditional for a husband and wife to make love on Erev Shabbat, on Friday evening. And the idea is that we, male and female, are making love, God's shadow here on earth, so that we're in a sense encouraging or even forcing God's male and female aspects in the heavens to join, at least temporarily. Robin, you have your hand up? I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to try to unmute you. You have, okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I did read that when you're talking about the soul, that the soul has a weight, and that they have weighed people or creatures before they die, and they weigh them after they're dead, and there is a loss of in human of, I don't know, about 3 pounds. Which
I've heard people say that. I don't believe it.
Why?
It doesn't make any sense to me from a physical point of view. And if it was true, it would be far more publicized. So,
Exactly. Yes.
So I can tell you, I've heard people say that. I don't believe it personally. And I've never seen any authoritative description of it. If you have, a scientific paper on that, I would love to see it.
Okay, I guess all you have to do is go look on, on the web and ask the question. They'll tell you.
Yeah, I can tell you, just because something's on the web, don't mean it's
Doesn't
true.
mean it's true. I
Right.
know.
As someone, I was talking earlier today when I discovered how easy it is to create your own website. It's frightening. Jay, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I really like this talk about God and the Sifot and the Shekhinah. In the book that you mentioned that I have studied with Sandy,
Right.
is it all possible somewhere? Have you ever studied God actually had a wife?
So what I would say,
Not a separate soul, not a
no,
separate
right,
part.
right. So let me address it. What I would say is, in the mystical literature, God has male and female aspects.
Right.
And so remember, one of the things we talked about earlier is, from the Jewish philosophers' point of view, they would emphasize the idea that God is without any physical form, God is just pure spirit. From the mystics' point of view, they go overboard in the opposite direction. So when they talk about God having male and female aspects, they image a male God and a female God, which also, takes a lot from pre-Judaic mythology. So
one more, and you've got a trinity.
yes, well, but we have 10, so why stop at 3? So what I would say is, again, the mystics are going overboard, imaging God and trying to understand God by coming out with dozens and dozens and dozens of images, each one of which gives us more insight into the nature of God. I personally don't take this stuff literally. I take it poetically. And remember, very major point about Judaism. It doesn't matter what you believe.
What you do.
Judaism
What you do.
focuses on what you do. So you can believe there's a male God and a female God, and I can believe, like Maimonides, that it's only spirit, and there's no assigning gender or corporality to God is blasphemous, is silly. But somebody's going to decide, how do I hang a mezuzah? What's kosher? What's not kosher? What time in the morning do I pray? And so on. That's the essence of Judaism. I am going to get back to my presentation. Yes.
Rabbi Lochner,
Yes.
Ruth, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. You brought up when someone goes to the hospital or does a good deed, God is there.
Mhm.
What happens if someone does an evil deed? Is God also the potential for evil?
Well, it's a very important question, and an interesting question. In Isaiah, it says God forms good and evil. So God creates both. I'm going to, talk about this in future classes, but I believe that God gives us free will. There's 2 big problems. One is evil, which is the result of humans making free will bad choices. And the other is tragedy, which is, earthquakes, tsunamis, COVID viruses. I can't pin it on someone. And, insurance companies like to call them acts of God. And they are 2 big problems. And they are deserving of a much deeper discussion. But I would say God creates the potential for evil and tragedy, and then teaches us what we're supposed to do. In effect, that's the brokenness in the universe, and God sends us into the universe to repair the vessels and
And do
release the
we
spark.
diminish God when we do evil?
I would
Is
not use
God
that language.
diminished?
I don't even know what that means, to be honest with you. I would say God becomes less visible, becomes less present. I would use that language, but I wouldn't use the language of diminished.
Okay,
But I've heard people use that. Bryce.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, it sounds to me as if we are putting puppet strings on God if we, and I don't mean that meanly. It's
Right.
just that if we can do something here and make something happen in heaven,
Yes. Yes.
okay,
So
then this is a way that we can assume control of the universe.
yes.
Okay?
So what?
In a way,
Yes.
we're usurpers.
Yes. So I would say the Kabbalists are very into that. The Kabbalists are very into the idea of God as a puppet master, and we're connected by strings. And there's even one beautiful image that I read every Yom Kippur that says we're connected with God by strings. When we sin, the string is cut. When we repent, a knot is made in the string. And of course, when you sin and repent a lot, the string gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And by continuously repenting, you actually get closer to God. It's a nice image you made. Okay, I'm going to get back to the presentation. So people asked about the afterlife. I'm often asked the question, what do Jews believe about the afterlife? My somewhat flip answer is, I don't know, go ask them. What does Judaism teach about the afterlife? That's a question I can address. And the main answer is that there is one. At two main teachings, one is resurrection, that when the Messiah comes, our souls and our bodies will be physically connected to each other, and we will be physically resurrected back to life. A mystical and Kabbalistic idea is in reincarnation, and that is that our soul comes back to this world in successive lives to continue work in the world. And then there's a discussion of communication between worlds, which is a Talmudic teaching. And it just so happens I've taught a class on this, and it just so happens that it's all in my website. What Happens After I Die, Jewish Views of the Afterlife, 3 sessions, and you can listen to it on your own, or maybe we'll repeat it someday. So definitely beyond the scope of this discussion. So I want to turn toward the conclusion of this and address the question of how do I get more spiritual? Step number 1, blessings and prayers. There's traditional blessings in Judaism. They begin with the words, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech olam. They're in 2 broad categories. Thanks for the good stuff blessings, such as bread, wine, and even going to the bathroom. And mitzvah blessings. Before we do a mitzvah, we say a particular blessing because we want to remind God and ourselves that we're doing this, we're lighting these candles on Friday night, not simply because we like candles with our Friday night dinner, but because God has commanded us to do so. And we are healing a little bit of the universe by fulfilling that mitzvah. There is also fixed liturgical prayer services. Not because God needs our prayer, but because we need to be the kind of people that gather together and pray. And then there's simply talking to God. One of my teachers taught me this. It's very powerful. Find a spot, regular basis, put your head in your hands, or this works for me, and just speak to God out loud, quietly, but out loud. One of 2 things happen. Either you're speaking to God and you should listen for a response. That's sort of the mystical insight. The less mystical insight is you are speaking the deepest truths of your soul. You cannot lie to God. It's absurd in this practice to not be telling the truth. And as you are speaking, you will hear yourself speaking your deepest truths. I do have, and it's on the website, a list of basic prayers. And, in other classes, we have a discussion of them. I just wanted to flash them up and show them to you. There really isn't time to go through all of these in any great detail. Step number 2 is seeing the holy in the world. There is a lot going on in the world that is holy and signs of God's existence. But you got to look for it. So the example I once gave before a sermon was think about going into a supermarket. Something we think about more these days. And think about in a world where most people don't even have, 40% of people in the world don't even have clean water. And a very large fraction of the world are hungry and don't have clean and healthful food, here you are. You're in an aisle and you are surrounded by clean and healthy food, and everything is organized and facing forward. It's beautiful. I mean, the cans are there. They're all facing in the right direction. They've been inspected. They're clean. And so in the context of this sermon, also you go over where the produce is.
Yeah.
And every now and again they get spritched. And if you're in a really expensive grocery store, they may even have a little thunder. So the broccoli over here thinks they're still growing. And it's just beautiful. Somebody is speaking and it's hard for me to mute you at this point. So then I'd like to go and ask the question of mustard. This forever became known as my mustard sermon. A God's gift of mustard. If I didn't have any mustard at all, I would be pretty happy. If I only had deli mustard, that's really all I need, Dayenu. So how many choices of mustard do I find? I went to, I think it was Gelson's before giving the sermon. And I counted my choices of mustard. So anybody want to shout out? I mean, some of you know the answer because you've heard me give this talk before. How many choices of mustard do you think?
30?
30?
92 or 93.
No, you heard it before. That was something else, but not quite that high. So
250.
so preparing for a sermon, I counted 39 choices of mustard at Gelson's. You have
Yeah, I had it
John
backwards.
and fine ground and coarse ground. So for another sermon, I couldn't do mustard again. So I went to Whole Foods Market and just counted choices of olive oil. And I counted 92. So you have, this is just olive oil, not saffron oil, not sunflower oil, not, God forbid, Crisco, just olive oil. Flavored here, flavored there, virgin, extra virgin, a little slutty. I've never understood that whole thing. So imagine we're in a world, I'm going to go back up. You're in a world that God so loves us that not only do we have clean food to eat, not only do we have mustard, but not only do I have olive oil, but I have to stand here and try and decide of the 92 choices I have, which one to pick. This is the idea of noticing miracles. So there is a wonderful story, which I love to tell, and I'm going to break the presentation. I'm going to take out my earbuds for a second. So the story goes something like this, that at the crossing of the Red Sea, there were two guys, I think Reuben and Shimon, I can't remember, the names actually were on the other slides. And they were just looking down. What did they see? Mud. So they're fetching, they're complaining to each other. Mud, mud, mud. Nothing good ever happens to us. We're following this lunatic Moses. You think something good would happen. He said there's a God, that God would do something for us. You know, I'm losing my sandal in the mud. Nothing good ever happens. The story goes that they completely missed it. That miracles happen all around us, but you have to lift up your eyes and see them. Think about the complexity of our bodies. Think about all the cells that are working in tandem just to make it possible to continue to exist. The mitochondria, the nuclei, the splitting. There are little machines that are running up and down your DNA, chopping out bad pieces of DNA, filtering things. It is just astounding. These are miracles. My definition of miracle is not a question of violating the laws of physics. My definition, I don't know that I have a good definition of miracle. Just something too astounding to happen on its own. So that's the point of this midrash, that you have to notice the miracles. So notice the miracles of your life. Notice when you've been blessed. The thank you card for these gifts is to share your blessings with God's children. As one of my teachers taught me, a gift without acknowledgement is a theft. So when we've been given gifts, as we are, we have an obligation to share those gifts. I found it helpful to make Jewish New Year's resolutions. Resolve to take on one new spiritual practice each year. It may be prayer, it may be dietary, it may not be all, I sometimes say you don't have to go whole hog, you should pardon the expression, kosher, but, maybe give up hogs, give up pork. It may be really easy since all those pigs aren't making their way to market. Or taking on the obligation to doing more in the way of good deeds. Don't let the best be the enemy of the good. The idea that you have to do everything or it really doesn't matter. The next step in being more spiritual is seeing yourself as God's hands. Moving your prayer from give me, God, I need this, give it to me, to teach me or help me, to use me. Remember, I had in the earliest class the difference between mystic and magic. Magic is if I do all these things, all the blessings and everything, I can get God to do my will. The mystic idea is if I discipline myself with all of these things, keeping kosher, praying and so on, I can get me to do God's will. You are God's shadow, so bring God with you wherever you are. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet quotes God as saying, "You are my witnesses and I am God." The rabbis in the Midrash say that this means God can only be God if we serve as God's witnesses. If we don't serve as God's witnesses in this world, then God may as well not exist. A commentary on other religions and this idea that religions have to claim that they have the truth. So many of you will know this legend of the blind examining the elephant. So the person standing by the elephant's foot says, I understand the nature of an elephant. Elephant is a tree, like a tree. The one by the tail says it's like a rope. The one by the body, it's a wall. By the ear, it's a fan. By the tusks, it's a spear. By the trunk, it's a snake. So, rather than just sort of asking the question, asking you to respond, all these people are speaking the truth. But on some level, that's impossible. The elephant can't be a tree and a rope and a snake and a spear. Maybe they should have a holy war and fight each other to the death to see which one holds the real truth about the nature of the elephant. Of course, I'm projecting this idea onto religion and to God. And perhaps we each can see and understand only a portion of God's totality. Our error is our certainty that our view is the only truth. And to this, I add the idea that the blind people all hear the elephant sound, much like a shofar. And I believe what they hear is the golden rule. So if you Google golden rule, there are hundreds of statements of the golden rule. This poster has a few of them. One of my favorites is, don't poke a baby bird in the eye with a stick until you try it on yourself. And there's a lot of them. So lots of suggested readings. This is the ones I put in the, in the slide. On the website, I have lots of detailed readings, and I put in bold the ones that I think are the best places to start. I want to read a little bit more of Larry Kushner, what he calls the last word. My mother, who turned 80 more than a few years ago, tells me that as you get older, it only gets worse. No matter what you say, God always has the last word. That strikes me as wise, particularly from a woman who has refined to high art the skill of getting in the last word. But what does it mean? But it does make me wonder, It does make me wonder, what exactly is the last word? If you and God have been adversaries, then the last word might be a triumphalist, I'm God, you're not. Or even worse, I'm God, you're dead. If you've been friends and developed a good working relationship, the last word might be, thanks for all your help. But if after all those years you've come to understand God as the infinite one, of whom you are a finite dimension, a unique but fleeting expression, then it would be, I'm God, so are you. Or maybe just, what took you so long? But of course, with all distinctions gone, the idea of a conversation itself is only a confusing metaphor. What can a wave say to the ocean? What can the ocean say to a wave? Before we begin our journey, we are at one with all creation. Once life begins, we find ourselves discrete, individuated, autonomous. And after the journey ends, God gets the last word, welcome. With some luck, we get glimmers of this great unity even during our lifetime. We realize that our life and everything else has all been part of the divine organism all along, that things are turning out just the way God intends. This is not to say that God is running the world like some overextended, occasionally underperforming puppeteer, depriving us of our freedom or moral responsibility. God is simply within it all. And when we become aware of this, as we do, during moments of great meaning or insight, it is as if God were the one who unites and therefore runs everything. Questions of free will and determinism become meaningless. Everything exists within and derives its reality from God, including us. We are dimensions of the divine psyche, seeking to become fully self-aware. And when we raise our consciousness, we not only realize that we have never been apart from our divine source at all, we realize that we also participate in the process itself. You may not be able to have an intimate relationship with such a God, but you are its pride and joy and its best hope. My colleague, Rabbi Nehemiah Poland, taught me that the world simply is. It is the way it is supposed to be, the way it must be. Such a vision is achieved by a surrender of the ego, by submerging yourself in the enveloping waters of divine being. We say the last word, oh my God, to the universe, and lose ourselves as we do. Being is not from or by God, it is of God. There is only one player, God. In the words of Deuteronomy, the Shema, the Lord alone is God. There is nothing else. All theology is autobiography. I am going to break. Let me just make a few announcements and then we can have a discussion. Next week on Thursday, May 28th, is Erev Shavuot, the night before Shavuot. Shavuot celebrates the giving of the Torah at Sinai. And there's a discussion of how people purified themselves for 3 days before receiving the Torah. So the mystics actually created this tradition, which we're not going to quite fulfill, of staying up all night long studying Torah. So many congregations have evening programs. I'm pretty sure Temple Adat Elohim will have one. The communities in Western Ventura County are getting together for a program with myself, Rabbi Lisa Hochberg-Miller, Rabbi Lisa Bach. 6 o'clock dinner and schmooze, a 7:30 program. And it's a little hard to read this, but it says, no bad raps and complaints. Naomi sets the bar for being an awesome Jewish mother-in-law. 3 rabbis give their perspective, and you join in the conversation too. This reflects the fact that the traditional reading on Shavuot is Ruth, the book of Ruth. I also want to just mention that not next week, but in the following week, and I'll get out the publicity on Facebook and email lists, and I think the member congregations will also publicize it, but this is your first heads up. I'm going to start digging into some specific Jewish topics, and the first one is this question that I highlighted: why or when bad things happen to us. So first session, the problem of human evil. Second session, the problem of random tragedy. And then 2 sessions on Jewish ethics, medical ethics, and business ethics, a discussion of what are the Sephardic Jews, and a discussion of the joys of Hebrew. So I am taking us back to our group chat room and just ask if anybody has any thoughts as we close.
At our table, we keep our masks on.
Rabbi Lotker, I
Yes.
enjoyed that very much and I learned
Thank you.
a lot.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. And am I wrong? or am I right? You were going to do a parody. Was that tonight? A parody on something? I remembered.
Yeah. So are you interested in this? This is a song. I tell you
Yes.
what. While others are asking questions, let me find a copy of the song so I get it right.
Okay.
Okay.
Love your parodies.
I think many of you may have heard this one before. But anyway, other questions or comments? I can hear you.
I just have one question, and it's if Rabbi Luria was from Spain, where we generally think of the Sephardics as coming from, why is his name Ari, which is Ashkenazic Rabbi Yitzhak?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer. His origin may have been, his family may have been Ashkenazi.
I do know when I lived in Seattle, where there's a larger Ashkenazic community than in the San Fernando Valley, where I came from, that there were a number of people whose last name was Luria.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. But when someone is called Ashkenazi, it usually means they are an Ashkenazi and they're living in the world of Sephardim. So I don't know, but evidently he traces his roots to Ashkenaz. It's a very good question. And any other questions?
Yeah, so when we were talking about the universe basically splitting open to make room for God separating himself to make room for the universe.
God
okay?
withdrawing from a spot.
Yes.
Right.
To make, yes, exactly,
Seems so.
basically. But this idea then is that it heavily implies that God is physical. Okay,
Yes.
is a physical and is a substance, or it occupies space. Okay,
Yes.
and that therefore it makes God into a kind of a thing, if you know what I'm saying, because he would be physical. Okay, because the God as we imagine him normally is that this is something that transcends space and time.
Okay, so that is, and that is sort of the debate between the rationalists and the mystics. So the rationalists, like Maimonides, very much speak about God as being only spirit and not substance at all. And when it says God took us out of Egypt with a strong arm, Maimonides specifically says the Torah speaks in the language of people, and it doesn't mean that God has an arm. The mystics go overboard in the opposite direction. And I don't know if you were here when I talked about this text. It's called Shiur Koma, which talks about the physical size of God's head and God's eyeballs and so on. So the mystics, in seeking to understand God, imagine dozens or hundreds of different images for God, one of which is, of course, the Sphirot, and God, as having components, one of which is very masculine and one of which is very feminine. And they talk about the right way things are in the world is when God and his Shekhinah are in bed making love together on the couch, which was in the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem. So it's, I look at this as poetic truths rather than literal truths. And the way I sort of look at it as imagine, you're a group and you're just beside yourself trying to understand the nature of God. And so the mystics are definitely not going to limit themselves to just spirit. Whereas Maimonides was living with the Muslim world in a time when Aristotle was being studied. And I think, in many ways, he sort of reflects an image in Judaism of being a little embarrassed about all these images and sexual images and in the size of God's eyeball. And I was reading another text. It wasn't, Danny Matt didn't go into the discussion. I had to try and find the original Shiur Koma. and they talk about the size of all of God's parts. I need to find this. So that, but they're definitely imaging it that way. And it's very much not like, when you say we image God this way, it's kind of like, what you mean? Who's we?
Who's we, paleface?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's supremely ironic to me that the rationalist believes in a non-physical spirit God, whereas the mystical ones believe in a physical God of rational physical substance, which is
I would agree with all those words except the word rational, but it would be it would be substance. I don't think they would describe it as ordinary physical substance, but something.
But it occupies space and time,
I would say, in some of these descriptions. And remember, it doesn't have to be consistent. I think what bugged Maimonides was how superstitious and inconsistent this stuff was. And the Muslim philosophers were coming up with an organized, rational theology of Islam, which answered all of these questions. And I think Maimonides and the Jewish philosophers were a little embarrassed that we didn't have one, because the rabbis were utterly unconcerned with that. What they were concerned with is, how do I hang the mezuzah? How do I make a kosher chicken? What time do I pray in the morning? How do I tie my tzitzit? And so on. They weren't concerned with theology. And, as you start reading all these stories, particularly some of the mythology, they are way inconsistent. And you can ask the question, well, which story is right? And the answer is, who cares? These are, you're looking at the elephant's foot. I'm looking at the elephant's trunk. Somebody else is looking at the elephant's tail. And, for those of us who are a little more mathematically inclined, we're only looking in 3 dimensions. What about 5 or 6 dimensions?
Or in dimensions, an infinite number of dimensions.
Right. So I would say the mystics are more into that, with the added complexity that everything is God. In that last little writing from Larry Kushner, he comes back to this idea, which I said is that one of the most fundamental teachings in Kabbalah that derive from Adonai Echad, God is unity. And I have trouble with that, but that's what the mystical teachings are. I think you get into trouble if you start taking this stuff too literally, or it gets very confusing. Okay, I think I am going to skip that parody. I don't think it fits with what I've been teaching, so we'll do it another time.
Good show tonight, Michael.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, so I hope to see you. I'm in my office every weekday from 4 to 5 Eastern time. I'm sorry, Pacific time. I'm getting confused now. And next week, Shavuot. And you can always check my website as to what's going on in terms of my teaching. And I can't do this without you. So thank you for being here and egging me on. And I'll see many of you at Torah study on Saturday morning. And Robin, I don't know if I'll see you tomorrow morning at Parshat HaShavua study. So take care and stay well. And
thank you so much.
And
thank you for your hospitality.
Yep.
Thank you, Rabbi.
It was very inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.